As you're opening up your Bibles, one of the things that I think you will notice is that these phrases that we're going to be reading, they sound almost verbatim for something we've already read. And you wouldn't be mistaken, because in chapter 5 of Matthew, we actually have these exact same phrases repeated by Jesus. They're repeated in a different context. They're repeated in a context that's surrounded by personal relationships, how to fulfill the law, what our relationship is to be to others, what lust actually does to a person. And that is the context in which Jesus presents his teaching on divorce the first time. What is an oath? What is a promise, a covenant, and whether it should be upheld or not? And if we've read that passage, I think it's clear to us that a covenant, an oath, a promise, it should be upheld. We already know what the answer is going to be from Jesus. And as we read this passage, the argument against divorce from Jesus remains essentially unchanged. There isn't any fundamental difference. He is not wavering in his conclusion, in his assessment of what divorce does. It is a conversation about the relationship and God's design for them. And in parallel, there is a conversation about the circumstances in which that covenant must be upheld. And I said chapter 18, I meant chapter 19. Let's start with verse 1. When Jesus had finished these words, he left Galilee and came into the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" Before getting married, I did some local outreach where we'd walk the streets and just talk with people about Jesus. I also went to a missions trip, and I always wondered, what was it that made me not particularly inclined to do just walk around and talk with people about Jesus, but made me so inclined to go somewhere else. And I think the essence of it basically came down to, I wasn't familiar with their problems. I wasn't familiar with the problems of their church, of the people that I was going to be working there for a month. And ignorance is bliss in that regard. And we oftentimes think that our calling is to someplace else, to solve some other problems. But the problems that are here and now, even though we get tired of them, they need to be dealt with. And Jesus gives us an example that he did not run away from the problems that were present right in front of him. The culture that he was ministering to, the religious people and the irreligious, they had a problem that he was not going to overlook. In chapter 18, it was all about those problems. Just the multitude. Who is the greatest? This problem of pride that the disciples had. The problem of temptation, which Jesus said that it is such a drastic problem that it is good. It would be better for you to pluck out your eye and throw it away. There were problems with lost sheep, with people who believed at some point and then walked away. There was a problem with forgiving those who sinned against us. How do you forgive someone who did something horrible to you and is now your neighbor, and somehow you have to forgive them? The problem where if we don't forgive, we'll stand with a debt before God that we can't repay. The problem that Jesus is faced with here is one that is common from antiquity all the way to modern time. It isn't a problem of the Old Testament or Jesus' time. It is a problem that is present here and now. But what we don't realize is oftentimes we want to run away from it. We don't want to deal with it until it is the burning problem of our lives. Our calling, however, is as much to the problems that are here and now as to those far, far away places. And Jesus addresses this problem of divorce. We've probably heard the statistic, right? 50% of marriages end in divorce. And with that kind of statistic, it's very easy to get into the same mindset that the disciples will actually have later on in verse 10. If there's a 50-50 shot of not making it, what's the point of even trying? What's the point of getting married? And though that statistic might be numerically accurate, it does tell a slightly incorrect story. In fact, in the 1990s, if you got married, chances that you'd make it to your 15th wedding anniversary were pretty good, 70%. If you got married in the 2000s, the chances were even better. You only had a 15% chance of not making it to your 15th wedding anniversary. Unfortunately, there's other factors that make those numbers sound a little bit better than they actually are. However, regardless of whether you made it to your 15-year anniversary or not, if you ask anybody who's been married for more than a few years and you ask them, what are things like, once those rose-tinted glasses come off from the honeymoon phase, which can last from 7 months to maybe 7 years, once those lenses come off, I guarantee you, every single married person, even in passing, has thought, maybe I shouldn't have gotten married. Maybe I shouldn't have gotten married, because at the end you come to terms with the fact that they are not the person you thought they were. You yourself are not the person you thought you were. And you have to face the facts. And you can no longer suspend your view of reality. If he's messy after 7 years, I'm sorry, ladies, it's going to be your lifelong goal to pick up after him. If your wife has not learned how to cook, guys, I'm sorry. It's either chicken nuggets or you become a chef. And we think of ourselves as fundamentally changing, but those are things that we don't realize on year zero, day one. You don't realize those things. So when the Pharisees approached Jesus with a question that seems quite innocuous, Jesus says, is it okay for Simon to divorce Salome? Is that okay? At least that's the way that it seems on the surface. It's actually testing his political, his religious worldview. Jesus, how willing are you to speak about something that we know your stance on, but the people around you aren't going to like? And Jesus doesn't pull any punches. And I can draw out 3 lessons that I want us to kind of look at this passage and see for ourselves. Verse 4, and he answered and said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, like the passage we read today, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, no person is to separate. Marriage is a covenant, not a contract. And we've heard that phrase over and over and over again. And Jesus, he refused to play the political games. They come to him with a question, is divorce okay? And he says, what is the fundamental assumption that you have about marriage? Marriage is not a contract, it is a covenant. And in Jesus' time, much like now, the world is split into 2 worlds. One that leans more conservatively, one that leads more liberally, and the interpretation of what divorce is, what it means, fell down onto one passage. Deuteronomy 24:1 says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens if he finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some indecency in her. This word indecency is literally the one they focus on. That he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her away from his house. That was the procedure. Some indecency is found, and the man can send her away. And on one side, you had the Rabbi Hillel. He lived around the time of Jesus, and on the other side was Rabbi Shammai, also in the time of Jesus. And the more permissive Hillel claimed that divorce was allowed for any reason. Much like today, he fell on the side that divorce is allowed. Did she say a bad thing to you? Divorce. Did she say not enough good things to you? Immediately divorce. Did she look at another guy in the market? Believe it or not, divorce. In fact, the disciples of Hillel, they interpret the old passage regarding indecency, not Hillel himself, but his disciples, to mean that even if he stopped liking the way she looked or found someone nicer looking than his current wife, he could divorce her. The word indecency that they interpreted here meant that. She's just not as good looking, and that is indecent. And unsurprisingly, men during that time, the apostles included, they really liked that deal. It was a great deal for them. You mean we can and we're religiously okay? And Jesus says, no, let's analyze that. Now, Shammai, he took a more conservative approach. His teachings actually sound very similar to what Jesus was talking about here. And he said indecency is sexual immorality. She cheats on you. She goes off and abandons you. And you notice it's she and she. The guy was never at fault. The guy was never at fault. Indecency only referred to the woman. As a result, divorce was only permissible by Shammai, but only for the guy. The woman was stuck. So divorce was permissible, but not necessarily required in the case of infidelity. So the question of the Pharisees can be seen for what it truly is. Jesus, are you really going to tell all of these men that really like all of your teaching that they can't divorce their wives? Is that really how far you're going to go? Now, we understand that these fairly religious people, they don't know the difference between maybe Sabbath and not Sabbath. So the guy that you healed on the Sabbath, that's okay. Like they didn't notice that. We understand that you had a teaching about taxes where you said basically pay your taxes. And again, understandable. Caesar would come and make us pay taxes anyway, so not really a controversial statement. But are you really not going to tiptoe around divorce? And Jesus says no. And if you want to take it even further to what the Pharisees are actually asking him, if you remember, what did it say? It said that Jesus came back to the area beyond the Jordan, Judea beyond the Jordan. The ruler of that area was Herod Antipas. And if that name sounds familiar, it is. Because he's already killed someone for talking about the divorce that he had. He's the one who killed John the Baptist, because John the Baptist said, you divorced your wife and you married another, and that is not right. And the Pharisees, if you think that they're that forward-thinking, they might have even come to Jesus and said, are you really going to go against Herod? And Jesus is probably thinking in his head, I've gone against one, I've outlived him, and I will go against this one, and I will outlive him as well. Jesus' response to the Pharisees' devious questions is a response of truth. It's not of pragmatism. It's not, oh, well, the woman in this relationship is suffering, or, oh, the guy in this relationship isn't going to have the best life that he can. He doesn't do that. He doesn't get pragmatic with them. He goes back to the foundational pillars of what creation and marriage sought to accomplish, right? He goes back all the way to Genesis. He says, I know you believe the Bible. Your interpretation might be off, but you believe the Bible. Why did God create marriage in the first place? What is the foundational reason? What is the foundational structure of marriage? Is it covenant or is it contract? What is marriage at its essence? And most of all, who makes the final ruling of whether you can or you can't leave? And ultimately, they have a choice to determine what do they rely upon. Pragmatism or Scripture? Is it divorce is good because it's convenient? Is it Scripture allows for divorce, so therefore we can do it? What is the reasoning? And the conversation about whether marriage is a pragmatic arrangement or whether it is a biblical covenant is fundamentally important even to our time. Because if we think about it, what is the world's view? What is the reasoning behind divorce being such a common aspect of our culture, of their culture, for goodness sakes? The underlying assumptions matter a lot. If marriage today is a tax benefit, you get tax credits for filing married jointly on your 1040 at the end of the year. So if the tax break disappears, maybe marriage won't make as much sense. If marriage is to make life easier, so that one spouse can provide and work and one spouse can take care of the kids, well, if one or the other doesn't fulfill their end of the bargain, what do you do? Do you go and find somebody who will? However, if marriage is a covenant that is not established by two people but by God, then it is not something that people set the rules for. Not something that people are bound to their own thoughts, desires, and conveniences. And a contract only functions when both parties get what they want. I get what I want, and you get what you want. It's good. A covenant functions as long as at least one party says, I will continue to be a part of this covenant. A contract, as soon as one person doesn't hold their end of the bargain, it breaks down. A covenant is even if the other party doesn't fulfill their end of the bargain, it continues to function. A contract is based on the math of equality. Any business contract, what does it say? Your contract with your cell phone company, what does it say? I will pay you $40 and you will give me 3 gigabytes of data. And then another company says, you know what? For $40, we'll give you unlimited data. What do? You break that contract. I am no longer getting the value for which I agreed. A covenant is based on the math of agape love, where you do not give because you can get something back, but because you're willing to sacrifice for the other person. You're willing to give to get nothing in return. T-Mobile, I will give you $40. Just build out your network. Make it the greatest one. Make that 5G coverage exactly what you advertise on TV. I don't need anything from you. And that's why Jesus pushes back in this way. They would have said, why we do this is because Moses said we could. Look, it's written right here in Deuteronomy. We can do that. We don't do it because we're pragmatic, Jesus. We do it because we're right. And Jesus says you must do it because of what is fundamentally true. And Jesus also realizes how real the sin was in the lives of the people he was talking to. How sin could destroy that marriages. And he says to them, the hardness of your heart. That is what breaks it down. Verse 7. They said to him, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus, we're not being pragmatic here. He said to them, because of the hardness of your heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning, it has not been this way. The only rule of Jesus is that marriage can't survive a hardened heart. It can't. It didn't survive it in the time of Moses, and it didn't survive in the time of Jesus. The pragmatism was pushed back, Pharisees. It was pushed back all the way to the time of Moses because a woman, like I said, she was not the one in control of the divorce. Her husband goes off and philanders somewhere. She has no right to divorce him. He does. The corrupt nature of people was such that Moses was given the choice of either forcing the woman to remain in a relationship where very likely she would be killed if the husband disliked her enough, or to just let her go. Give her at least some shot at survival. In Leviticus, it was quite thorough on the specifics of the law. In chapter 27 of Leviticus, it even puts a value, as morbid as it sounds, on a human life. Below the age of 20, a woman's life was worth 10 shekels. And you might think, wow, that's pretty good. A man's at the same age was worth 20. We had the 3/5 compromise when there was slavery in the United States. A slave was worth 3/5 of a free white man. Slightly more than half. So in the time of Jesus, a woman was worth less than a slave was here in the United States when slavery abounded. And as such, if the desire was to get rid of a wife was sufficiently great, it put her life in danger. So it was a pragmatic decision because of the hardness of your hearts. Divorce was given as a compromise, not as a commandment. Not as a commandment. Don't do it because God commands so, but because the hardness of your hearts will result in far worse consequences. And even in our time, when divorce is more or less normalized, the final blow to a couple's relationship oftentimes is the unwillingness to compromise. In fact, the Gottman Institute, which was work that was done by Dr. John and Julie Gottman as clinical psychologists in the area of relationships, It found 4 categories, 4 what they called horsemen of the apocalypse, horsemen of divorce, taken from the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in Revelations. And what they found is there were 4 behaviors that if you could identify in a relationship, and if they were happening without either person trying to redirect them, you had a 93% accurate prediction of whether they were going to divorce or not. 93% accurate. If you go in and you as a psychologist are listening to a couple and you're watching their interaction and you notice these things, it's worth putting a bet on to know which way it's going to go. And these 4 were criticism, and it refers to attacking one's character, saying that somebody is lazy, instead of saying something like, it frustrates me when you don't help around the house. So that was horseman number 1. Defensiveness, where you blame your partner. You're not at fault for any of the problems in the relationship. They're the ones who didn't prepare the meal, and that's why you're angry. They're the ones who didn't put away their socks. That's why you threw stuff at him. Contempt, blatant disrespect for your partner by doing things like sneering, rolling your eyes, or using disrespectful humor to show contempt for them. And stonewalling. And this behavior is more common in men, and I think you guys will identify if you've ever been in any kind of marital or relational fight. You shut down. You completely disconnect and withdraw during the conflict. And they said if those 4 things are present, we can predict whether they're going to divorce within, and I think it was the next 6 months to a year and a half. It was crazy to think that those behaviors were so predictive. And the most interesting thing is that it's so close to what Jesus describes here. The hardness of heart. A hard heart is what ends up causing the divorce. The unwillingness to change, the unwillingness to reconcile differences. And the Bible's purpose is to show that there is nothing that exists in the known universe that is irreconcilable. And you only have to look as far as Romans 5:8, where it says, "But God demonstrates his own love towards us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." The ultimate irreconcilable difference existed between God and man. And that was not enough. That was not enough to keep God apart from humanity, and it is not enough to keep one from the other in a marriage. The hardness of the heart is what causes irreconcilable differences. A marriage is reconcilable in so many different situations. When criticism is replaced with positive expression of need. You threw something, and when you come in and you make a mess, it just makes my life harder. There's so many things that I have going on. When defensiveness is replaced with taking responsibility for your part of the conflict. I understand I didn't cause the fight, but I definitely continued it, and I'm sorry. Where contempt is replaced with the appreciation of the positive characteristics of the spouse. You didn't do the dishes, but man, you cleaned the house so well. Where stonewalling is mitigated by taking a break to clear your head, to return back to the conversation, not to withdraw, not to say, I have no part in this, I don't want to talk about it. Clearing your head, refreshing your mind, coming back and saying, let's deal with this. It is important. A marriage is also stronger than what the world can throw at it. Children born with special needs is not a difference that can't be overcome. Infertility, when no children are born, is not a difference that can't be overcome. Terminal or debilitating disease of the other spouse is not a difference that can't be overcome. Even the survival of sexual sin, as we'll read in the next verse, is not enough to take a soft heart and make it hard if the person chooses to. But a hard heart is something that is not survivable in a marriage, regardless of the other circumstances. Regardless of what is going on, if you've got a hard heart, it doesn't matter what else is going on. You might have the best and most brilliant children. They might be savants. You might have married somebody who is brilliant, who's beautiful, who is resourceful. It's not enough. You might be financially stable, carefree, healthy, perfect in every way, the envy of everybody around you, but if your heart is hard, you won't survive in your marriage. In verse 9, and I say to you, this is Jesus speaking, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. This phrase, I say to you, it's used 58 times in Matthew. It's used in the other Gospels as well, but in Matthew it's used 58 times, and the purpose is to put an accent on and to draw attention to the difference between what is accepted in that time and what the right thing actually is. Jesus over and over uses that phrase, but I tell you, but I say to you. So here the contrast is, you believe that you can divorce your wife for any reason, but I say to you that except for sexual immorality, divorce is equal to adultery. I know you've got your preferences, I know you've got your ideas, I know you've got your scriptural verses memorized, but it's still adultery. God's design for marriage was such that you must follow it if you wish to obey it, so that His word would be done. The language of covenant is essential. The language of covenant, understanding that marriage is not a contract, it is not the ability to write out the terms. There is no prenup in a covenant. There is no agreement that if within 5 years you divorce me, then, I get to keep all my stuff and you leave with nothing. There is none of that. Because it isn't trying to make it an equivalent relationship. Time and time again, Israel abandoned God. They said, we're going to go out and we're going to go and follow after other gods. We're going to go and we're going to worship them because they offer us something that we think you don't. And they left. They left, and God said, I will not break my covenant with Israel. They will bear the consequences, and I guarantee you that any covenant that is broken bears consequences for the person who is breaking it. But I will bring them back. I won't abandon them. And we often call the joining of two people as a marriage covenant for that specific reason. Under that covenant, rules take a backseat to love and forgiveness. Under the rules of behavior, God had every right. Moses had to talk God down, in essence, when he wanted to strike Israel after they left Egypt and they disliked what God provided. And Moses said, no, God, don't do it. You have a covenant with them. You have a relationship with them. One person has to keep their end of the covenant. It's you, God, and I know that you will. The people didn't, but you will. And if you do, we will survive. Under the laws of our country, every spouse has the right to air out the dirty laundry and misdeeds of their husband or wife if they go to court for divorce proceedings. A covenant doesn't do that. And even in this passage, Jesus' statement, it isn't a command, but a permission. You can divorce for sexual immorality, but that is not an absolute requirement. And it's so interesting because this passage, it comes right after Peter asking, how many times do I forgive? How many times do I go back? How many times do I get hurt and still come back? But even in this passage, the commandment against divorce is specific. A lot of the discussions have been had on the perspective that even evangelicals should have for divorce. And it kind of falls in three different levels, from the more permissive to the more restrictive. The more restrictive side, you have, you can't divorce for any reason. If they cheated on you and you leave them, then you stay single. It is to show what God can do even in such dire circumstances. In the middle, you have that it is permitted but not required if there's immorality, sexual immorality. And the more permissive side, it is allowed for immorality as well as other reasons, abandonment or physical abuse. And I'm not going to argue with you which of those specifics we fall into. My personal opinion is it's somewhere between the last two, where divorce is allowed for sexual immorality, but if you were abandoned or if you're physically abused, separate yourself. Separate yourself. You're not going to be able to marry somebody else, but you don't stay in a place where your life is in danger, much like in the time of Moses. But don't divorce them. And such restrictions, even for Jesus' time, they caused the disciples to respond and say, what is going on, Jesus? Why are you clamping down on this right that we have? And the disciples, in verse 10, said to him, if the relationship of the man with his wife is like this, it is better not to marry. And Jesus' point here is that marriage is not the ultimate source of our happiness. Marriage, in the end of all of that, whatever happens, if your spouse leaves, if your spouse doesn't leave, if you're in a happy marriage or an unhappy one, you have to understand that marriage is not the ultimate source of our happiness. The more focus we put on that, the more likely we are to be disappointed, no matter how minor the inconvenience is. And in verse 10, that's why they said that. Like, maybe we shouldn't marry. And it echoes the sentiment of American society today. I mentioned the fact that the divorce rate probably isn't around 50%, right? The divorce rate is a little bit less, but one of the reasons for that is actually because people just aren't getting married. Sure, of the people who did get married in the 90s, 70% of them made it to their 15th anniversary, but that doesn't mean that everybody who lived together, had a relationship, had kids, got married. So the statistics, they kind of are difficult to interpret. Are we headed in a good direction or in a bad direction? Is it better not to marry so we will just live and sleep together without signing some contract? Because divorces get messy. But Jesus says, no, marriage is not the ultimate source of your happiness. And next week we'll actually go over exactly that. That exact point, that those who remain unmarried by either their own choice or by the choice of the circumstances that happened around them, there can still be life, there can still be work to do in the kingdom. And this sneak peek into next week's message is that marriage is not the only way to find satisfaction and purpose in your life. Video team, next slide. The disciples, they make a very poignant observation when they say that it is better not to marry. Yes, for some of those, the restrictions and requirements make it so that it is better not to marry. For some of you who are currently single, the restrictions on it might be significant enough that it is better for you not to marry. For others, it's better that they do. But guess what? There was never any married person who sacrificed their life for the redemption of humanity like Jesus did. And Jesus, he lived a completely full life as a single man. One who was not bound by marriage, and yet he redeemed humanity. Now, again, we can only aspire to such high marks on our life, but the idea is there, isn't it? Our life is not bound by marriage because marriage is not that ultimate source. The more we transform it into something that it isn't, the more likely we are to be disappointed. And we put a burden on our spouse when we say that marriage is going to be the only way that I get happy, that I find joy in my life. And if we put that burden on our spouse, they will be crushed by the weight of being a little g God in our life. My husband, he needs to be handy. He needs to be responsible. He needs to not procrastinate. He needs to be good with kids. He needs to be good around the house. He needs to have a good paying job. He needs to continue getting better jobs. He needs to be clean. He needs to be helpful. He needs to be sacrificial. And the list goes on and on and on and on. He needs to be kind. He needs to be loving. He needs to do all of these things, and he needs to do them perfectly. It's like, man, you get to the point where you're like, okay, what are the differences then? What does God have that your husband doesn't? The same thing applies to your wife. What are the things that God then has that your wife doesn't? Like, what kind of person are you expecting to serve you? And the quote from my message 2 weeks ago from Pastor Bonhoeffer about idealism in the church, it felt so relevant to marriage as well. And he talked about the fact that, we create an ideal version of church in our mind, and we are disappointed when we don't meet it. And we do the same thing with marriage. We create an ideal that by creating that ideal, by holding ourselves to that ideal, we actually destroy what is in front of us. If we love the dream of marriage more than the one we are married to, we will destroy both. If we love the ideal more than the person, we will destroy both. If we love the ideal of the church more than the church, we will destroy both. If we love the ideal of who an unbeliever is and what they're supposed to look like and what our role is, we will destroy the unbeliever and not bring them to God. And even though our intentions in marriage are honest and earnest, we start to demand these idolized versions be fulfilled by our spouse, by God. Like, God, I prayed for a godly wife, and you sent me Eve. I'm just glad there's no snakes in our house. We enter into marriage with demands set by our own preferences and judge our spouse, our marriage, and God himself accordingly. I have a coworker, and I've been talking with her for probably close to a year. And she's always on the verge. She's like, I'm not going to leave my husband, but man, I wish I could get out. I wish I could go out and I could live the life that I hear my girlfriends talk about, where they just go to bars and it's whoever, whenever. I never got that. And it's like, how do you pull that person back from the edge? How do you pull them back and say, no, I understand that that's what seems good, but it's going to end up in a destructive place for you. How do you pull a person back? How do you pull yourself back from those thoughts? How do you pull yourself back from those thoughts, regardless of what state of life you're in? If you're in dire straits right now, know that there is still hope, both for you and for your spouse. God can soften a heart. God can redeem the irredeemable. God can transform that which is completely lost. Both your heart and your spouse's. Because a covenant is involving two people, but it requires just one to keep it together. If you are in a happy marriage, be on the lookout. The four horsemen, they're always right around the corner, waiting to spell doom and destruction for your marriage. And if you're single, don't expect something ideal. Expect to be sacrificial. Because in the end, if we love the dream of marriage more than the person we are married to, we will destroy both. And Jesus here said, you're striving for some ideal, Pharisees. You're striving for some ideal apostles. You're striving for some ideal crowd. And in the process, you destroy marriage after marriage after marriage in hopes of finding that ideal, and you get nothing. And you're worse and worse for it. As we look into this passage, we are reminded again and again. Jesus came down for us. The symbols of the blood and the body of Jesus that are before us in communion are a reminder of that. I came down to you when you were not worthy of anything. And I died for you when you were not worthy of my death. And I rose for you, despite you being unworthy of salvation. And I offer you salvation, even if you feel like you're not worthy. As we stand right now, I ask you to stand. Let that thought go through your mind as you pray quietly in your seats for a minute or so, and then I will conclude, and we will start our second part with communion. Loving God, we come before you, Lord, with the realization that the church, your bride, is imperfect in so many different ways. Yet you came down and you died for us that we might have salvation, that we might have a hope to be that ideal, to finally reach it in your presence. And you give us marriages as a training ground, as a place where our true nature comes out. That we might be refined in those fires, the fires of disagreement, the fires of conflict. But that those fires would breed stronger relationships. That they would breed stronger people who understand what it means to sacrifice, to put oneself down for the other, to show what your covenant with us is like. Covenant of redemption, a covenant of salvation. One that we're reminded of monthly as we come to partake in communion. I pray for all the marriages in our church today. Those who are on the rocks, who found something else that makes them happy in the short term, that you would pull them back through divine intervention, Lord. That they would see that it is only with a life that is in accordance with your commands, a life where a heart is soft, is a life in a marriage that is worth keeping. So that as we come together as husband and wife to you, in front of your throne, we will stand separately and we will give an account on our own. And then we will separate in heaven. And we will be our own people, and we will have with us those memories of a sacrificial life, of a sacrificing marriage, of one where our hearts are soft to each other, just like your heart is soft for us. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.